In the remote mountains of West Virginia, in the year 1901, something was discovered that would haunt the people of Black Creek for generations. A barn, ordinary in its appearance, weathered by wind and snow, standing quietly among the trees. But inside, the unimaginable, 37 men, missing for years, found chained, broken, used, reduced to shadows of themselves, their humanity stripped away, their freedom taken as if it had never mattered. And the most terrifying part, the town had known. For 20 long years, travelers and drifters passed along the narrow, winding Pike Road, young men with calloused hands and hope in their pockets, looking for work in the mines, or simply seeking a place to rest. Some never returned. Rumors whispered through the taverns, the general stores, the churches. Whispers about two sisters, Elizabeth and Martha Pike, who lived alone in the mountains. Women who drew men in and never let them leave. Women who were said to possess a charm that could bind a person's will as easily as iron chains could bind a body. The sheriff, a man of the mountains, a man who had seen enough death and misfortune to excuse almost anything, dismissed the disappearances as accidents, collapsed mine shafts, frosted winters, men who lost their way. Nature, he said, was cruel, but fair, and the townspeople, caught between fear and indifference, said nothing. Until one man arrived from Charleston. Thomas Abernathy, a journalist driven by questions that most would never ask, by curiosity that could not be sated by vague excuses and whispered warnings. He came to uncover the truth, to shine light on what everyone else had chosen to ignore. What he would find would not just shock a town, but challenge the very idea of what ordinary people can tolerate, how silence can become a companion to cruelty, and how a remote mountain road could hide the darkest of human acts in plain sight. This is the story of the Pike Sisters' breeding barn, of the 37 men who disappeared, of the lies that allowed their suffering to continue, and of the relentless search for truth that brought one man face to face with horrors no one should ever have to witness. For 20 years, men disappeared along the winding Pike Road. Young travelers, drifters seeking work in the coal mines, or simply passing through these mountains, vanished without a trace. Families reported missing sons, brothers, friends, yet answers were scarce, and fear kept the town quiet. The mountains were harsh, the winters deadly, and the roads treacherous, so most accepted the explanations given, or offered none at all. But the whispers persisted. Stories about two sisters, Elizabeth and Martha Pike, circulated like smoke through the town of Black Creek. Women who lived alone on a secluded farm, women who could charm men, who drew strangers toward them with ease, and who, according to rumor, had a darkness in their household that no outsider could see, until it was too late. Sheriff Brody, a man shaped by the mountains and their hardships, dismissed every report as coincidence or misfortune. Collapsed mine shafts, frozen rivers, men lost in the woods. He said these were the only reasonable explanations. But Thomas Abernathy, a young journalist from Charleston, saw patterns that others refused to acknowledge. He saw the same road, the same farm, the same women connected to decades of disappearances. Thomas had spent years chasing stories dismissed as superstition, knowing that often the most disturbing truths hide in plain sight. And so he came to Black Creek, carrying with him newspaper clippings, photographs, and the determination to uncover what everyone else had refused to face. His arrival would begin a chain of events that would expose a nightmare carefully hidden in the mountains for decades. The town itself seemed to breathe around him, wary and watchful. Conversations ceased when he entered rooms. Eyes followed him through the general store, the post office, the diner where coffee was thick and bitter. Even the old women who normally welcomed strangers spoke in riddles or turned away, hinting at the unnatural hold the Pike sisters had over the place. One woman, Mrs. Caldwell, would whisper to him of the sisters' strange ways and the men who never returned, warning him that some things were best left unspoken, and some stones never turned. Thomas Abernathy stepped off the morning train into Black Creek, the air thick with mist and the scent of pine. His leather satchel carried years of research and a determination to uncover a truth long buried beneath fear and silence. The town seemed to shrink away from him. Conversations stopped mid-sentence, doors closed a little too quickly, and eyes followed him with an intensity born of suspicion. The young journalist had come to investigate the disappearances, but the town had already made its choice. Silence. When he asked about the men, the road, or the Pike sisters, he was met with vague warnings, shrugged shoulders, and fearful glances. Those willing to speak did so in hushed tones, careful to leave the walls of the room untouched by their words. It was Mrs. Caldwell, the elderly woman who ran the boarding house, who first cracked the veil. She brought him coffee, her hands trembling as though carrying more than a cup, carrying the weight of years of secrets. "You're asking about things that ought to stay buried," she whispered. "The Pike women. They charm men. Men go up that mountain and don't come back the same. Some don't come back at all. Been that way since they were young. Maybe 20 years now." Thomas listened carefully, noting the subtle tremor in her voice, the way she glanced toward the window, as though afraid someone, or something, might be listening. He realized then that the whispers were not mere superstition. They were warnings, fragments of truth dressed as myth, handed down in fear. Piece by piece, Thomas began connecting the dots. Every missing man, every whispered story, every fearful glance, led back to the Pike sisters' property. The pattern was undeniable, and yet the town remained obstinately silent. After hours walking the winding Pike Road, Thomas Abernathy finally reached the clearing where the Pike farmhouse sat, isolated and unremarkable at first glance. Its weathered timbers bore the weight of decades of harsh winters, but it was the barn, low and fortified, that drew a shiver down his spine. Windows boarded from the inside, heavy iron locks, reinforced timber. This was no ordinary farm structure. As he stepped onto the covered porch, the door opened silently. Elizabeth Pike appeared first, tall, angular, and severe, her face carved from years of solitude and mountain hardship. There was no curiosity in her eyes, only the calm of someone used to controlling what entered her domain. "Miss Pike," Thomas said, removing his hat with careful politeness. "I'm Thomas Abernathy from the Charleston Gazette. I hope to learn about life in these mountains, perhaps for a story about families living in places the world has forgotten." Elizabeth's lips pressed into a thin line. "We don't speak to newspaper people. Got nothing to tell city folk." A soft, musical laugh drew Thomas's attention, and Martha Pike appeared behind her sister. Shorter, sharp-featured, but with a smile too wide, too empty, too deliberate. "Now, sister," Martha said in a voice that carried a sing-song cadence, "maybe the gentleman just wants to hear how we serve the Lord." "Wouldn't that be nice?" Thomas noticed the subtle signs that something was wrong. Every gesture, every word felt rehearsed, calculated. And then his gaze fell upon a wooden bird resting on a small table, a bird identical to one carved by Jacob Morrison, a missing man from 5 years earlier. The precision, the familiar style, it could not be coincidence. For the first time, the story he had chased in newspapers and whispers became horrifyingly tangible, The Pike Sisters were more than peculiar mountain women. They were hiding something deadly. Thomas Abernathy knew that talking to the sisters would reveal little. Their words were polished, rehearsed, a performance designed to mask decades of cruelty. So he turned his attention to the courthouse, to the dry, dusty records that no one else had bothered to examine. In the faint light of dawn, Thomas picked the back door lock with careful precision, moving silently among filing cabinets thick with dust and neglect. Old property deeds, land purchases, dismissed complaints, all the fragments of a story that no one in Black Creek had wanted to tell. Over 20 years, the Pike Sisters had quietly expanded their domain. 12 separate parcels of land, all purchased for cash, all consolidating isolation. The maps and records told the tale of deliberate control, each acquisition a step toward creating a kingdom removed from curious eyes. And then, buried among the forgotten files, Thomas found the complaint of Ezekiel Marsh, a traveling preacher. Marsh had reported seeing men working on the Pike farm who moved like sleepwalkers, eyes downcast, voices barely above a whisper. He had accused the sisters of ungodly seductions, of holding a man against his will. The complaint had been dismissed, brushed aside as the ravings of a drunk. No investigation, no follow-up. 2 decades of missed opportunity. And now, Thomas could see it all with horrifying clarity. The pattern, the willful ignorance, the deliberate silence of an entire community that chose comfort over conscience. Thomas realized that the real horror was not just what the sisters were doing, but that everyone had turned a blind eye. Every disappearance, every unexplained absence of a young man in the mountains had been ignored, dismissed, or rationalized away. The evidence was there, patiently waiting for someone willing to see it, someone willing to follow the trail all the way to the Pike Sisters' barn. Armed with knowledge from courthouse records and the preacher's complaint, Thomas returned to the Pike property. Every step up the winding Pike Road waited with anticipation and dread. The mountains loomed, mist curling around the trees, the air thick with the scent of wet earth and decay. The barn stood silent, fortified, a testament to decades of secrecy. Its boarded windows and iron locks seemed to challenge any who dared approach. Thomas studied the structure, noting the locks, the patterns of light, or lack thereof, from within. The subtle sounds of movement carried faintly across the clearing. Days of observation revealed the sisters' routine. Elizabeth emerged at dawn to tend the fields. Martha moved like a shadow among the farmhouse rooms. Every footstep, every creak of the porch, became a clue in Thomas's mental map. He memorized their habits, timing, and blind spots, knowing that even the smallest mistake could be fatal. By nightfall, the storm had arrived. Rain pounded the roof, wind tore through the trees, and the perfect cover was in place. Thomas approached with a pry bar, the cold metal slick in his hands. Every breath, every heartbeat seemed amplified. Each step toward the barn, a step into the unknown. Thomas tested the first lock. It held fast. Sweat mixed with rain on his brow. He adjusted his leverage, each groan of the metal sending echoes across the empty clearing. Time stretched. Minutes felt like hours. Every distant sound, a falling branch, a gust of wind, a bird startled, was amplified into imminent danger. Finally, the iron lock gave way with a reluctant groan. The door creaked, the darkness within the barn swallowing him whole. A smell hit first, faint at first, then unmistakable. Damp earth, sweat, and something else that made his stomach turn. Thomas stepped inside, every sense alert. Shadows danced across the walls. boards groaned under unseen weight. Thomas stepped further into the barn, lantern trembling in his hands. The darkness seemed to thicken with every step. Then the smell hit him fully. Stale sweat, unwashed bodies, and something else. Medicinal yet cloying, impossible to place but unmistakably human. And then he saw them. Chains bolted to walls, to support beams. Faces pale as parchment, eyes vacant. Ribs visible beneath skin stretched thin by years of neglect. 37 men, all shapes and ages, from teenagers to men in their 40s, moving, or not moving, in rhythms that spoke of endurance beyond comprehension. Some stared at him, hope flickering briefly before fear dimmed it. Others barely registered his presence at all. A young man, Samuel, approached cautiously, voice hoarse from disuse. "You're not one of them," he whispered. "Please, help us." The others murmured in soft, disconnected tones, recounting forced labor, long days of servitude, and the rituals imposed upon them. Herbs and compounds, administered nightly, kept them compliant. Identity and memory were slowly stripped away, replaced with what the sisters called devotion, obedience, and purity. Thomas felt a cold wave of horror. These were not just missing men. They were captives, systematically reduced to instruments of control and breeding. The scope of the sisters' cruelty was staggering, the precision of their planning chilling. Every iron link, every board, every locked door a testament to decades of meticulous preparation. Thomas moved among them, absorbing every detail. Samuel and a few others shared their story in whispered fragments. Men brought here under the pretense of work, coerced into obedience, broken physically and mentally, chosen nightly for rituals the sisters called sacred. Every action had a rhythm, every day carefully structured to reinforce submission. And as Thomas listened, as he recorded every detail in his mind, the realization settled like a stone in his chest. The horror was no accident. This had been planned, maintained, and hidden for decades, while the town, the sheriff, and the law looked the other way. Every chain, every shadowed corner, every whispered word confirmed a truth more terrifying than any tale he could have imagined. The Pike Sisters' barn was a prison, a laboratory of control, and a monument to a human cruelty that had been allowed to flourish unchecked. Thomas awoke to the cold, hard reality of the barn. Chains biting into his wrists and ankles, a taste of blood and bitter herbs lingering in his mouth. Darkness pressed against him like a living thing. Around him, the men stirred quietly, some whispering names they feared to forget, others rocking back and forth, eyes glazed, stripped of memory and hope. He realized quickly, this was no brief imprisonment. The Pike Sisters had perfected the art of control. Daily routines masked the horror of captivity. By day, men labored in the fields, tending animals and chores under the watchful eyes of Elizabeth. By night, Martha assumed her role, overseeing rituals that left men compliant, broken, and confused. Her methods were chillingly systematic. Herbs and concoctions rendered resistance painful, disobedience impossible. Repetition and psychological conditioning erased identities, leaving only the husks of men who had once lived, loved, and dreamed. Names, faces, histories, each stripped away like layers of skin. Thomas began to see the hierarchy of cruelty. Elizabeth enforced with iron precision, a figure of authority and intimidation. Martha was the architect, the mind behind the ideology of obedience and purity. Together, they created an ecosystem of control, one that left the men compliant, terrified, and ultimately broken. Even as despair seemed to consume the captives, Thomas noticed the smallest sparks of resistance, whispers of real names, memories of loved ones, fleeting glimmers of the men they had been. Samuel, the young man he had met first, became a quiet anchor. He reminded the others of who they were, teaching Thomas the fragile methods of maintaining humanity in a place designed to erase it. The horror was compounded by the realization that this was all deliberate. The sisters had refined their methods over decades, learning, observing, adjusting, ensuring that no one could escape, and no one outside could understand the depth of their crimes. Every chain, every nightly ritual, every enforced silence was a cog in a machine of oppression. Weeks had passed in darkness and quiet despair, but in the shadows of the barn, hope began to flicker. Thomas and Samuel discovered a weakness, a loose floorboard near the iron ring that bound Samuel's ankle. One careful application of pressure could snap the chain's hold, a tiny crack in the walls of their captivity. But to succeed, they would need timing, patience, and an understanding of the sisters' rigid routines. Thomas memorized every sound, every step on the farmhouse porch, every subtle shift in the sisters' nocturnal habits. He noted when Elizabeth prepared meals, when Martha tended her nightly rituals, and when the darkness outside the barn might mask movement. Every heartbeat, every creak of wood, every gust of wind became a signal. Then came the storm. December. Winds tore through the hollows, rattling the barn's timbers and masking the sounds of their preparations. Thunder would cover the breaking of chains. Lightning would illuminate fleeting moments when the sisters' attention was diverted. It was their one chance. Samuel whispered instructions, his voice barely audible above the storm. Set fire to the hay, smoke and chaos. We move while they rush to protect their property. Head to the farmhouse. Martha keeps the keys, the rifle above the mantel. Use it only if necessary. As flames licked the edges of the barn, the sisters appeared, Elizabeth wielding her axe handle, Martha's eyes blazing with fury. But the men, long thought broken, moved as one. Chains became weapons, courage replaced fear, and years of captivity fueled a surge of desperate strength. Thomas fought through the smoke toward the farmhouse, securing the rifle and the keys, while Samuel and the other men engaged the sisters directly. The barn became a theater of chaos, but for the first time in decades, the captives reclaimed agency. Martha fell, struck down by the very prisoners she had sought to control, while Elizabeth was subdued and disarmed. In that night of fire, smoke, and rebellion, the chains that had bound 37 men for decades were broken. The Pike Sisters' reign ended, not quietly, not unseen, but in the desperate, chaotic courage of those who had endured, suffered, and finally fought back. For Thomas, the story was no longer about headlines. It was about bearing witness, about proving that even in the darkest corners, humanity can rise again. When the smoke cleared, the horror of the Pike Sisters' barn lay exposed. 37 men, long thought lost, were finally free, though many would carry the scars of captivity for the rest of their lives. The state police descended, questioning townspeople who had long turned away, revealing the layers of silence that allowed this nightmare to persist for decades. Thomas Abernathy's story, The Silent Harvest of Black Creek, went on to shock the nation. The Pike Sisters' crimes, once whispered in fear, became undeniable truth. Sheriff Brody faced disgrace and imprisonment, a stark reminder that neglect and complacency can be as damaging as the cruelty of monsters themselves. But even as justice came, the memory of what had been endured remained. Some men would never recover, their minds fractured beyond repair. And Thomas, haunted by what he had witnessed, understood that heroism carried a cost, that bearing witness sometimes meant carrying the burden of human cruelty long after the story was told. The burned barn stands as a silent monument to both horror and survival. Its charred timbers reach skyward like ribs of a beast long dead, a reminder that evil can flourish where silence reigns, and that vigilance, courage, and conscience are the only barriers against its return.